The sound of his voice filled the room before I even knew what I had done wrong. It wasn't shouting, not exactly. It was sharper than that, controlled, tight, the kind of anger that didn't need to be loud to make its point. I stood there, a teenager frozen in place, eyes lowered, heart beating faster than I wanted it to. The rules had been broken, or maybe they hadn't. Sometimes it was hard to tell. In our house, the rules didn't always need to be written down to be enforced. My father stood near the doorway, shoulders stiff, jaw set. He spoke slowly, every word measured, as if he was choosing them carefully so they would land exactly where he wanted. I remember thinking how quiet everything else felt. The clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Even my own breathing felt like something I should control. In moments like that, you didn't interrupt, you didn't explain, you didn't defend yourself. You waited. Waiting was part of the lesson. Silence was part of the discipline. I remember nodding when he finished, even though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Maybe it was the rule itself. Maybe it was the reminder. Or maybe it was simply the understanding that questioning anything would only make it worse. When he turned away, the room felt empty, even though I was still standing there. That was how many moments in my childhood felt, heavy, quiet, and final. If you grew up in a house like that, you know the feeling, the sense that love was present but always wrapped tightly in expectations, that respect mattered more than comfort, that obedience came before understanding. At the time, it felt normal. Looking back, it feels like the beginning of something that followed me for years. Our home was an ordinary American house, the kind you'd pass without noticing. Neutral paint, a living room that stayed tidy, furniture that didn't move much. The television stayed off more than it stayed on. The quiet wasn't accidental, it was maintained. This was years ago, before phones followed you everywhere. Evenings were slower then. Dinner happened at the same time every night. Chairs were pushed in when you stood up. Shoes were placed where they belonged. Nothing about the house was chaotic. Order mattered. Order was safety. My father believed deeply in structure. He believed discipline built character. He believed discipline prepared you for the world. And maybe in his own way, he was right. The world can be harsh. He wanted to make sure I was ready for it. But readiness in our home came with a cost. As a teenager, I learned quickly that it was better to observe than to speak, to listen more than I talked, to read the mood of the room before making any move. I could tell how the evening would go by the way the door closed when he came home, by how his keys landed on the table, by whether he loosened his tie right away or left it on. You learn those things when rules aren't always explained, only enforced. School wasn't much different. Teachers praised obedience. Quiet students were good students. I fit that role well. I followed instructions. I didn't cause trouble. Adults liked me because I didn't demand much. Inside, though, I was always alert, always careful, always aware that one wrong move could bring consequences I didn't fully understand. At home, conversations were brief. Questions were practical. How was school? Did you finish your work? Be ready on time. There wasn't much room for feelings. Feelings were private things. If you had them, you dealt with them quietly. I spent a lot of time waiting for permission, waiting for approval, waiting for the right moment to speak, though that moment rarely came. I learned how to sit still for long periods, pretending I was comfortable when I was really just careful. Listening became my strongest skill, not just to words, to silence, to what wasn't said. I could tell when a rule was about to matter again. I could feel it in the air. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a constant awareness, a low hum in the background of your life. It tells you when to stop, when to stay quiet, when to disappear into yourself. And yet there was something motivating in it too, even then. I wanted to do things right. I wanted to be someone my father could be proud of.
I believed that if I followed every rule closely enough, if I stayed quiet long enough, everything would feel easier. That belief carried me forward. It pushed me to be careful, to work hard, to avoid mistakes. On the outside, it looked like discipline had done its job, but inside, something else was forming. A habit of holding back, a habit of silence, a habit of obedience without connection. At the time, I didn't question it. Nobody did. These were just the rules. And in our house, rules were not meant to be questioned.
There was one evening that stayed with me more than all the others. Not because it was louder, not because it was harsher, but because something inside me changed, quietly and completely. I was a teenager by then, old enough to think I understood the rules, old enough to believe I had learned how to stay within them. That night, I thought I had done everything right. I came home on time, I finished what I was supposed to finish, I didn't argue, I didn't talk back. I moved through the house the way I always did, careful not to disturb the order that mattered so much. Still, something was wrong. My father was already tense when I walked in. I could feel it before he said a word. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He asked a question, a simple one. I answered honestly, thinking honesty was always the safest choice. I was wrong. His expression didn't change much. That almost made it worse. His voice stayed low, controlled, but firm. He pointed out where I had failed. Not loudly, not angrily in the way people imagine anger. It was more precise than that, more deliberate. Every word landed slowly, leaving no space to respond. I remember trying to understand what he wanted from me in that moment. Was it an apology? An explanation? Agreement? The rules weren't clear anymore. They felt like they had shifted without warning. And standing there, I realized that knowing the rules didn't always protect you from discipline. He talked about responsibility, about expectations, about how the world wouldn't be forgiving. I'd heard these words before, many times, but that night they felt different. He wasn't just correcting behavior, he was making a point, and the point felt final. I stood there, hands still, eyes lowered, listening. My mind was racing, but my body stayed quiet. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. I didn't want to make it worse. The safest choice felt like silence. At some point, he stopped talking. The quiet that followed was heavier than anything he had said. It felt like a door closing, not slammed, just firmly shut. That was the moment. Not the discipline itself, not the words, but the realization that followed. I understood in that quiet space that what mattered most wasn't how I felt or what I meant. What mattered was compliance, alignment, obedience without question. Understanding wasn't required, agreement wasn't necessary, silence was enough. Something inside me shifted then. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped believing that explaining myself would help. I decided, without saying it out loud, that the safest way forward was to say less, to feel less, to keep more of myself hidden. I didn't cry. I didn't react. I nodded when it was over. I went to my room and closed the door gently, the way I always did. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not doing anything at all. That room had always been my quiet place. That night it felt different. It felt smaller, less like a refuge and more like a holding space, a place where I could stay invisible. I replayed the conversation in my head again and again, not to argue with it, but to learn from it, to make sure it wouldn't happen again. I wasn't thinking about fairness. I wasn't thinking about emotion. I was thinking about adjustment. How do I change myself so this never repeats? That question stayed with me long after the night ended. From then on, I became more careful, not just with my actions, but with my thoughts. I learned to anticipate disappointment before it happened. I learned to correct myself internally long before anyone else needed to.
Discipline had moved inside me. On the surface, everything improved. I made fewer mistakes. I stayed out of trouble more than ever before. If you asked my father, he might have said the lesson worked. But something else was happening too. I was becoming quieter, not just in speech, but in presence. I stopped sharing things that mattered to me. I stopped bringing questions home. I stopped expecting conversation to lead anywhere safe. That night taught me obedience, but it also taught me distance. It taught me that love and approval were conditional, that being close required being careful, that silence could protect you better than honesty ever would. I didn't know it then, but that lesson would follow me for years.
After that night, nothing dramatic happened. There were no big changes on the surface. No new rules were announced. No long conversations followed. Life went on the same way it always had. And that was what made it harder to notice what had shifted. The house became quieter to me, even though it had always been quiet. I spoke less at dinner. When asked questions, I answered briefly. I learned how to give just enough information to avoid follow-up. I kept my tone neutral. I watched faces closely, especially my father's, trying to sense when I should stop talking altogether. It wasn't fear in the way people imagine fear. It wasn't panic or shaking or tears. It was something steadier than that, a constant alertness, like living with one ear always open, even when the room was silent. I stopped sharing small things first. A thought I had at school, a joke someone told me, something that confused me. Those things didn't feel necessary anymore. They felt risky. If they didn't matter, why bring them up? Then I stopped sharing bigger things too. I kept my struggles to myself. If I was worried, I dealt with it alone. If I felt unsure, I told myself to figure it out quietly. Asking for help felt like drawing attention. Attention felt dangerous. At school, teachers praised how well-behaved I was, how focused, how mature. They didn't see the effort it took to stay that way. They didn't see the thoughts I swallowed before they reached my mouth. At home, my father seemed satisfied. I wasn't causing problems. I wasn't pushing boundaries. I was doing what I was supposed to do. In many ways, I became the version of a child he believed discipline should create. But connection faded. We talked about schedules, responsibilities, expectations. We didn't talk about feelings. We didn't talk about doubts. There was no language for those things in our house. Silence filled the gaps where understanding might have been. I remember sitting in my room at night, the light low, thinking about conversations that never happened, things I might have said if I felt safe enough to say, questions I had no place to ask. The words stayed inside, unspoken, until they felt unnecessary. Over time, I stopped noticing their absence. That's the strange thing about silence. At first, it feels heavy. Then it starts to feel normal. Eventually, it feels like who you are. I became more careful in every part of my life. I chose my friends wisely. I avoided conflict. I stayed within lines that were never clearly drawn but always enforced. I learned how to disappear emotionally while still being present physically. Trust became harder, not because I didn't want to trust, but because I didn't know how. Trust requires openness. Openness requires safety. Safety wasn't something I associated with speaking freely. Even when nothing was wrong, I stayed guarded. Even in calm moments, I waited for correction. The discipline had done more than shape my behavior. It had shaped how I related to the world. I didn't rebel. I didn't act out. I didn't break rules to prove a point. I became smaller instead, quieter, more distant, obedient without connection. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it felt like shrinking. And no one noticed, not because they didn't care, but because silence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It just settles in and stays. That quiet followed me into adulthood, into relationships, into conversations where I should have spoken but didn't, into moments where honesty felt dangerous, even when it wasn't. It all traced back to that house, to those rules, to that night when something closed quietly and stayed that way.
It took me many years to understand my father. Not excuse him, not judge him, just understand him. When I grew older, I began to see the world through adult eyes. I saw how pressure works, how fear gets passed down quietly from one generation to the next, how love can exist without knowing how to speak. My father had grown up in a different time, a time when rules were seen as protection, when obedience was mistaken for strength, when questioning authority was treated as weakness. He believed discipline was the way you prepared a child for a hard world. In his mind, he wasn't taking something away, he was giving something necessary. And in some ways, he did. Discipline taught me responsibility. It taught me patience. It taught me how to survive uncomfortable situations. It taught me how to stand on my own feet when no one was offering help. But it also took something quieter. It took ease. It took the feeling that mistakes were safe, that questions were welcome, that emotions had a place to land. It took the version of me that might have spoken more freely, trusted more easily, asked for help without hesitation. As an adult, I had to learn those things slowly. I had to teach myself that silence is not always strength, that obedience is not the same as respect, that understanding grows better in calm spaces than in fearful ones. I don't look back with anger anymore. I look back with clarity. My father did what he believed was right, using the tools he was given. I became who I am by learning which parts of that upbringing to keep and which parts to gently let go. And maybe that's the real work of growing up. Not rejecting where we came from, not blindly repeating it either, but choosing carefully what we carry forward. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Many people grew up under strict rules that were never questioned. Many learned silence before they learned confidence. Many are still discovering their own voice later in life. If you feel comfortable, take a moment to reflect on your own childhood, on the rules that shaped you, on what they gave you, and what they may have quietly taken away. If you want, you can share a memory in the comments. Not to blame, not to accuse, just to remember. Sometimes putting words to the quiet parts helps them finally loosen their grip. And sometimes understanding the past is the first step towards speaking more freely in the present.